Just because someone commits a violation of policy doesn't mean that they're a bad cop, doesn't mean that they're a bad person. I honestly believe that when an officer is involved in a shooting or critical incident, the community absolutely deserves to know what happened, but also for the officer.
Welcome back to Internal Affairs, a police podcast here with the IA guy and another special guest. And we're going all the way to Albuquerque, New Mexico. And you know what? When I think of New Mexico, I think of cactus, I think of dry land. And Daniel, who's going to be joining us, is going to tell us a lot about New Mexico because he did work at APD, if you will. And he is the owner of an awesome, it's not just an Instagram page, it's a very educational police law news that we're going to get into. But hey, Daniel, let me ask you something, man. Thank you. You're Code 6 at Scene with me. Thanks for coming, brother. I really appreciate it.
It's an honor to be on. Thank you so much.
Let me ask you, did I kind of describe it a little bit of Albuquerque? Is it dry, a lot of desert land?
You described it pretty good. You know, a lot of times when people hear New Mexico, they think of a couple things. They think of Breaking Bad and MMA. So,
okay. And I take it, and you can educate me. Breaking Bad was it filmed out there, or does it have that style or that vibe?
yeah, so the show Breaking Bad takes place in Albuquerque, and it was actually filmed in Albuquerque. So it's a pretty big deal here. And typically, when I meet people from around the country, they talk about the MMA stars that we have in Albuquerque, like John Jones and Holly Holm, and Breaking Bad. That's about all that people know about Albuquerque. And yeah, it's a lot of it's dry, but northern New Mexico looks a lot like Colorado. So.
Well, hey, man, let's get right into it because you and I have been following each other on Instagram. I know you've been seeing my stuff, and I've been seeing your stuff. You've been around. I didn't know. I just checked your YouTube channel. You've been around for quite some time, and it's, it's growing and growing. You did pull the pin. We'll talk about that a little bit in January, the beginning of this year. It's going to be 1 year. How is retirement, by the way?
Retirement is good. Retirement is good. Yeah, I retired in January earlier this year, and I'm young. I'm only 41, so I missed the job, but it was time for me to retire from the Albuquerque Police Department. But I still miss it. I still think about it.
Yeah, no, totally. I've been out 2.5 years, and I often talk to my partners at LAPD, and I definitely miss them, my colleagues. But the job, and I got to tell you, we'll talk a little bit about that more as we move on. Let me know that when you saw internal affairs, what was your first thoughts? Because here's the deal. You worked internal affairs, and so you and I share that common interest. What's your thoughts, man? I'm curious to know because here's the deal. You came out in 2005, so you have 20 years on your belt, and I have about 24, 25. Why is it there's this negative stigma attached to internal affairs? And then when you saw this podcast, you're like, what's going on over here? Thoughts?
That's a really great question. And I think that the negative stigma really comes from TV and movies. Because before I was a cop, I thought that internal affairs was this proactive unit. I thought that it was like NYPD Blue, where IA guys were staking outside your house. And obviously, that is not the truth. That's not what happens in internal affairs. But I think that until you're actually there, and not even in the police academy or even after you, do you really understand what internal affairs does? And so unless you're a police officer who's actually not only in the field, being investigated by IA, but a lot of times I feel like it's not even until you're working as an investigator in IA until you know what the day-to-day is like and what this job really is. And the first time that I saw the IA podcast come up or in your channel on an Instagram, I was interested. because as you know, there are a lot of different police channels and police podcasts, and a lot of them are great, and I listen to a lot of them, but there are none that talk about internal affairs from an honest point. And the first time I heard your podcast, and it was really talking about some of these issues about what internal affairs actually is, talking about it in an honest way, I was like, I'm hooked. This is great stuff. This is stuff that not only people need to know, but I think police officers need to know as well.
Absolutely. Hey, it's so taboo. It's hush hush. And well, lately with my guest, I've been saying about how the hypocrisy, right, in our line of work runs so high in terms of, hey, we're the thin blue line and we're supposed to be this one big family. But when you get an IA, I can't talk to you. You're in the island all by yourself, to the point where sometimes you get even ostracized. And we've had this conversation. Let me ask you this. When you were in the academy, and I know you were there in 2005, right? Did anybody like come in and say, hey, we're from internal affairs. This is what we do. These are our functions. Or tell me about your first impressions of internal affairs.
So I don't remember anyone in the academy coming in and talking about internal affairs. What I do remember is representatives from the police union coming in and saying, hey, if you get a target letter as a target or witness from internal affairs, before you do anything, call us. We will fill you in. So I do remember that. And, as you know, in the police academy, you're getting so much information. Just that was actually pretty helpful because that's all you really need to know is that, hey, if something happens or you get a target letter, call these people and they could walk you through whatever that process happens to be. So that was really all I knew about in internal affairs from the police academy, and I didn't give it another thought until I got my first target letter. Then I made that phone call. But it's one of those things where you're a brand new cop. You're like, I'm going to do everything right. And even if I
Yes.
do something wrong, my intent is going to be good. I'm here because I'm trying to help someone. So, I'm not really worried about internal affairs. And it just wasn't something I really ever considered until I got that first target letter.
Wow. Well, this is the first time I've heard target letter. That sounds so like, dude, I'm out to get you. Like, you got a bullseye. And correct me if I'm wrong. You can educate me. Does our target letter is because you're being accused, or it could also mean that you're a witness to possible alleged misconduct?
So the official letter that you get is called a target letter from the Albuquerque Police Department. And in that target letter, you can either be a witness of the investigation
Oh,
or a target of the investigation, but that's the terminology that is
wow.
still used.
Yeah,
And I don't know
we
anything
call
else.
that we call that today's victim, tomorrow's suspect. That's unfortunately that's how the system works. And again, across the nation, each agency has their own uh, disciplinary machine system, if you will, and we all can agree that it could be fine tuned. Maybe you need to change the assembly line, et cetera, et cetera. But we'll get into that. Daniel, let me ask you this: if you're in a room full of sergeants right now, today, and they're getting ready to begin their tour of internal affairs as an investigator, what's the one thing you want them to know about their job?
The one thing that I would want a sergeant with in internal affairs to know is basically to always just be as objective as possible. And I know that might seem simple, but that's really what I would want people to know, because I think a lot of times people go to internal affairs and they are objective, and they don't, and they really want to see what the actual evidence is. But what I've noticed that when you have people who are there for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, they might not be as objective before because they're like, I've seen this officer before. I know his other cases. I know what else they've done. I've seen a tasing just like this in 8 other cases and it was out of policy. So, don't be just be objective, even if you have a lot of time in.
Yeah. Would you agree with me that at some point during the levels of review, it gets personal?
I think it can. I do know in cases that I've been involved in that I have seen that happen from time to time, but that's not always the case. But it definitely
Yeah,
happens.
no, for sure. It's self-serving. you know,
Absolutely.
hey, Daniel, oh, I know him. You know what? He's good to go. Let's just unfound these complaints. Or, hey, Marlon, oh, for sure. I know this is going to come back sustained, because he's just done it in the past. And, you want to leave your biases at the door. And I couldn't agree with you more. But uh, what I want the audience to really, really know is when we do start having these conversations of internal affairs, and you can agree with me on this, Daniel, is that we're really talking about a very small fraction of the population amongst officers. It's not like there's like the movies, like you said, in the TV. It doesn't happen all the time. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree. It doesn't happen all the time. And I think it's also important to know that just because someone commits a violation of policy doesn't mean that they're a bad cop, doesn't mean that they're a bad person, even if they have a sustained violation of policy, because the policy book could be 300 pages. It could be against policy to eat in your car while you're driving someone to jail. That is an actual policy violation. And that's what they'll say. This officer had three policy violations. Well, yeah, but two of them were for eating in the car. So I think it's really important to know, okay, what was that actual violation of policy? How serious was it? And I think that that context is really important.
Yeah, and you know what? I've had a guest talk to me about they call it what, general orders, GOs. Is that what they call them?
Yes.
And he says that there's every day that you're out in the streets, you're violating a GO, right? You're violating. You are. I mean, you're driving, and like you said, you got to answer your phone. It's your wife. Maybe it's an emergency. Oh, you violated policy. What needs to change in a way is that not every violation of policy deserves a full blown IA.
So I would agree with that. And I but I also see it from the other side. So when
Mhm.
I started with the Albuquerque Police Department, our internal affairs and the way that we handled violations of policy really went in the exact opposite direction for a lot of things. What I mean by that is that it was unofficially that if an officer in your if you were a sergeant and an officer in your squad did something that maybe violated policy, maybe was unsafe, that there was no mandatory. This has to be reported up the chain of command and turned into internal affairs investigation. And essentially, sergeants would keep these, they call them hanging files. And it was up to the sergeant where they would type it out, what happened, and they would document that they spoke with you, and they would have a file, like literally a hanging file on the side of their desk. And at the end of the bid, at the end of each year, the sergeant would make a determination about whether or not that your hanging file got thrown in the trash, if you learned something, or
Yeah.
if it went to that next sergeant. Well, that isn't right either. And
Yeah.
I don't know how much you know about the Albuquerque Police Department, but in 2014, we entered into one of these DOJ consent decrees.
Yeah.
So we kind of went from that to where almost everything was unofficial, which I agree wasn't great, to literally the exact opposite, 10 years under the rule of the Department of Justice. So I was able to see this police department really go from one extreme, which wasn't good, to
Yeah.
the other extreme where they're at now, which, in my opinion, also has issues.
Danny, I want to get your opinion on this because in your police law news, you inform the public about critical incidents more than anything. Is what you post the most, right? OISs, in custody deaths, and excessive force. It's what we call law enforcement related injuries, LERIs. Cause we love acronyms. We just got to have, and then the new administration comes on and they'll say, hey, change that division and we'll make some more new acronyms. It just drives me nuts. But all I know is that they're LERIs, meaning if you're involved in an incident where the suspect is hospitalized, then it becomes a critical incident. And, it requires a call out, notifications to FID. And, here we go. And we have a full blown investigation. What I wanted to ask you in a long way was when you violate policy as it relates to use of force, uh, do you think that should be a full blown IA?
Yes,
Or
I do.
have you even had OISs where, you know what, look, man, everything that led up to the point where you actually pulled the trigger and engaged was just all screwed up. So, yeah, we'll send you to training. Yeah, we can tactical debrief and send you to a whole bunch of like different courses and all. But is it really an IA? What's your thoughts?
So when you say IA, I guess where I'm going to take that question is I think that every use of force has to be investigated fully. And at
Correct.
least the way that my police department did it, our internal affairs was split into two different sections. Internal affairs, professional standards, which is
Okay.
like typical IA, and then internal affairs Force Division, which is just use of force investigators, and that's what I did. So many times, and I would say more times than not, after a use of force was fully investigated through all the levels, and if there was something at the end of it, most of the time it was training. It was okay, maybe it's not training for this officer. Maybe there is a deficiency in the policy.
Mhm.
And so sometimes that would come out of it. But for there to be an actual violation of department policy, I think that has to be looked at. But from my experience, the vast
Right.
majority of the time, there actually is no violation of policy when there is a use of force.
Going back and thinking about uh, in your job with the many of the investigations that you did in these critical incidents, is there one where you thought to yourself, man, look, man, this deserves some framing of allegations? That's what I actually meant by an IA, meaning, yeah, internal affairs investigates. Get it. Professional standards, force investigation division, full blown investigation. That's fine. But I'm talking about when you start making decisions about the tactics where, let's just say the taser was deployed, non-lethal, or a takedown. All these tactical applications before it actually became an OIS, there's a lot of scrutiny. And sometimes the scope becomes so narrow that they say to themselves, man, you know what? We're going to have to frame some allegations and like sustain, because this is just all screwed up and it was bad. And maybe they deserve some suspension. I don't know. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, so I do have a case like that. It was actually the last case that I handled in Internal Affairs Force Division when I was an investigator. And even though the Albuquerque Police Department has somewhere around 1,000 officers, I still know just about everyone. But this case involved a friend of mine, someone I had been friends with for 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
And, this was a case where essentially the call came out where it was an individual who had a gun, and he was pointing the gun at a moderately busy intersection, and he was pointing it at drivers that were driving by.
Okay.
Multiple people called in. My friend was an officer. He was working in undercover capacity, so he was in plain clothes. He had an unmarked car. He gets to the intersection. He sees the guy that they're talking about, but he's not pointing a gun at anyone. So he basically advises dispatch. Long story short, after a couple minutes of watching this guy does pull out a gun. He pulls out a gun and he starts pointing it at traffic. Now, the officer, he doesn't engage right away. He keeps eyes on. He lets dispatch know because, again, he's in plain clothes. And especially with the Department of Justice, he wouldn't easily be identified as a police officer. And to get into an officer involved shooting, that would be cause a lot of problems, obviously.
Right.
So this guy, he wasn't firing or shooting. The long story short is the officer, he basically was able to do like a tiny town. He did an incredible job of coordinating two
Mm-hmm.
different groups of officers coming from two different sides. In order to basically converge on this guy, and this thing ended with a beanbag shotgun. So that's what they ended up doing. They used a beanbag shotgun in
Okay.
order to get this guy in custody. No one was injured. The guy had minor injuries. But I was the investigator that was assigned to this case. And when I was looking at this case, we had such a terrible policy at the time that if the officer couldn't articulate a specific threat, then the use of the beanbag shotgun was out of policy. So I
Yeah.
had this case where objectively, my friend did the right thing. He did the right thing. He didn't use deadly force. No one was injured. This could have been an officer involved shooting, but it
Yeah.
wasn't. He did a brilliant job of coordinating two different groups of officers coming from two different sides in order to basically confront this individual in the safest way possible. And it ended with a beanbag shotgun. And you're going to call that, by our policy, it was out of policy, and this officer was going to get days off. And that was extremely frustrating for me because I knew that he objectively, from a 360 view, he did the right thing. And this
Yes.
guy, he's getting days off. And that was incredibly frustrating for me as an investigator.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of what we call in our language. Of course, we all have buzzwords, right? So we call that list substantial deviation, right? So if you deviate substantially from department policy or procedure, right? In this case, being the beanbag policy, um, that's fine. We're okay with that. In LAPD, we do a very good job to say, hey, you want to deviate from the policy? That's fine. Substantially, that's okay. But the question is, can you explain that? Can you justify and articulate why that deviation was so substantial. And of course, it's subjective, right? We don't know how you measure substantial, right? It can be here, it can be here. Who knows? It just depends on the circumstances. And I get all that, right? Real life variables that are going on, basic concepts that you learned equals deviation, which is fine. So it's totally understandable. You can agree with me that probably in any critical incident, there's going to be some deviations.
Absolutely.
Right. Because again, you got these real life variables, nighttime at training. Well, I got trained like 10 years ago on this beanbag. Okay. So I just know what I know at the time that someone showed me how to deploy the beanbag. And yeah, I kind of read it, but hey, it's check the box, right? On the computer. I just looked at the policy and I checked it and I moved on. Got it. But if you're not able to articulate, like in this case, this is a perfect, spot on textbook. Like, hey, not only did I coordinate, right, had this oversight, like a incident commander to make these two teams, but this is what we did. And yeah, man, sometimes these decision makers don't really understand the flexibility that you need when it comes to a critical incident.
Absolutely. And, that's easy to get frustrated as not just an officer. I can't even imagine the frustration that I had would be nothing compared to what the officer felt in this one. But from my end, as the investigator, I was so frustrated. And the point of me telling this story that I like to tell people is that in all of our investigations, at the end of it, there was a place where we could recommend a policy change, and that's what I did in this case. And listen, I'm not going to say that I was the only one in the department who recognized our policy needed to change, but about a year later, it did change. And our
Yeah.
policy changed where if that had happened a year later and all the way up to now, that would have been in policy. So a lot of times it's easy to be frustrated, but sometimes there is an avenue. And if there is
Yeah.
an avenue to make some type of positive change, do it. And that is one of the reasons why I always say that that's why we need good, objective, and smart people in internal affairs. Because listen, you may have to call this one out of policy, but if you see that there's an issue with the policy and there's a recommendation that
Yeah.
might change things for the better for other officers, that's why we need good people in internal affairs.
If you don't mind me asking, or if you don't mind sharing, what was the outcome of your partner's IA?
He got a couple days off.
Okay.
They found him out of policy. He got a couple days off, and yeah, he wasn't happy about it. And it's just one of those things, that so
Yeah.
the heartache of this is if he's ever involved in another if he's ever involved in a subsequent officer involved shooting, the first thing they're going to say is, well,
Yes.
he already has a sustained violation for excessive force, for
Yeah.
not following the use of force policy. Now he's in another, now he's in another, now he's in, well, not another, but now he's in an officer involved shooting, or now he's in another use of force
Critical
case,
incident.
and that can
Yes.
only be used negatively against him. No one's going to go through the context that I just did that, hey, had this happened a year later, the department admitted this was a bad policy. We've improved it. But there is no going back. There's no mechanism to go back and say,
Yeah.
hey, this officer would have been in policy. He actually shouldn't have gotten those days off. And yeah, so that's part of the frustrating part. But that was the result. I think he got 3 or 4 days off for
Okay.
saving this
Well,
guy's life.
let me ask you this. Would you agree with me with this quote? The punishment's not the penalty. The punishment is the process.
I agree with you 100%. And I've
Now,
heard you
let me
say that
ask you
before, and I love
this.
it. Yes.
If you were to ask your friend, what was worse, the way he was treated while he was going through all this, or the 3 or 4 days?
Oh, the way he was treated 100% and not knowing what was going to happen. So an out of policy beanbag, an out of policy serious use of force, they could try to terminate you for that. I mean, I don't know if they'd be successful, but that an out of policy serious use of force that
Yeah.
caused injury, that's something that you can get terminated for. So the 4 or 5 months that this was pending, that he didn't know what was going to happen, that was the hard part. If he knew at the beginning, hey, dude, you're going to get 3 days off, it sucks. He would
Yeah.
have taken that. It's the not knowing in the middle. You've got 16, 17 years on, and here you don't know what's going to happen, especially in a police department where every administrative decision,
Yeah.
especially around use of force, is governed not by the people in your own department, but everything is managed by the Department of Justice, and you don't know what they're going to say.
Who do we hold accountable for that to be
So
treated
I
that way?
so I
What's your
think that
thoughts?
Yeah, so the people that we have to hold accountable for that are people who write the policy. So it was the whoever wrote the policy and approved the policy in the first place to allow for this to be a violation of policy. And I think it's true when they say that most of the time it's not people who are doing things intentionally, trying to make things bad for police officers. Whoever wrote this policy didn't think that this could happen because really quick what they wanted the officer to do, even though this guy, he wasn't holding a gun at the time, but he was just armed, pointing a gun. So what they wanted the officer to do per policy at the time was to go hands on with this guy. Now, you go hands on with someone who was just holding a gun, the chances that that's going to evolve into an officer involved shooting
Yeah.
are pretty high as opposed to using a beanbag shotgun from behind cover. And so it's like obviously the Department of Justice isn't trying to induce more officer involved shootings, but when you have bad policy that anyone can see as a bad policy and no one is there in the room to speak up or to have their voices heard,
Yeah.
that's the problem.
Yeah. No, totally. I
It's the
think
leaders of
it's
the department.
what you spot on. That's where I was heading with this is that unfortunately, we don't have command staff or the levels of review to be courageous, hold their integrity, and say, you know what, this is a bad policy. And what he did, uh, in my opinion, was he probably deviated from the policy, but hey, man, look at the end result. And what message do we send to the not just to the officer, to the rank and file, that you can do all this? And my thinking is the suspect was wanted, and I'm sure he was convicted and all that. Is that correct?
He was drunk out of his mind, and I don't think he knew what planet he was on.
Yeah. See, and you have an individual who deserves to be apprehended, right, and go through the whole criminal justice system. And next thing you know, yeah, you did a great job, but you violated that policy. So now we're gonna ding you for that. It's unfortunate. And you know what? I really believe that how we change the stigma or get away from that negative stigma is having these conversations. And I hope to reach as many police podcasters or many people who are doing this to have some fluidity about, hey, man, you know what? Maybe you might want to look at policy. And to top it all off, you're on a consent decree, which I'm sure was even worse, right? Like, oh my God, I can't believe you guys are doing this.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was difficult to work in that environment for a long time. But I made the conscious decision in 2020 to go into internal affairs to really at least try to be a part of fixing what was going on. I wanted to be a part of it the last couple years of the career I had with the Albuquerque Police Department, and I thought that this was the best way that I was able to help out was to basically go into internal affairs force division, and then later I was an investigator in the compliance division.
Let me ask you this. Did this particular assignment kind of prompted you or gave you that idea about police law news?
It didn't. No. So I was already thinking about police law news before. So I was already thinking about police law news and having these conversations with people
Mm-hmm.
before I started police law news. But what I think is that I didn't know what direction I was going to take it in. So I'm going to change my answer. I never had any use of force training, experience, investigation until I went to internal affairs force.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it was once I was in there that I thought, okay, I like to talk about these I issues in policing. I think it's interesting, and I couldn't believe how interesting I found use of force. So it was being in internal affairs force division for a while that I thought, not only do I think this is interesting, but I think I have the experience to be able to talk about this and have these conversations.
Do you feel that the community and the people around you, when you're off duty, right? I guess I'm speaking for the majority of the public, if you will. You think they were misinformed or they have a certain perception about law enforcement?
Especially when it comes to use of force, people are unbelievably misinformed. And that's part of what I try to do. What I try to do is if I talk about honest criticism a lot, and
Mm-hmm.
obviously you have free speech, you can say whatever you want. But if you
Correct.
want me to take you seriously, what I like is honest criticism. If you think a police officer did something wrong or the use of force was excessive, I'm good with that. But what I want you to do is tell me exactly what the officer did wrong. Where in the sequence did you say, okay, this is what the officer did wrong? And then tell me, What should the officer have done? And then back that up. Point to law, policy, training. And that's the kind of criticism I like to have. And because that's an honest discussion that we can have. And, and a lot of times I'll go on different podcasts and I'll really do a deep dive into a lot of these cases. And that's where I think the most interesting discussion is not just all police are bad, all police are
Yeah.
racist, all police are tyrants. That to me, that just isn't interesting commentary. What's
Mhm.
interesting is, hey, the officer was dispatched here. Why did he do this? Why didn't he do that?
Mhm.
Okay, great. Let's look at law, policy. Let's really have a discussion there to see where the issue is.
Yeah. And on that same vein, as we're talking about this, um, you informing the public, what challenges, I guess that's the best way to ask you this. What obstacles or challenges did you face when you were starting police law news,
So
if
some of the
any?
cha- Yeah, so some of the challenges that I get are just it's people believe myths about police officers.
Mhm.
They don't understand basic things. And here's the so no, here's what the biggest challenge is that I have no experience in auto mechanics or baking. So I would never in a million years dream of going on a YouTube channel of someone who's a master mechanic for 20 years and telling them that they're taking apart a carburetor incorrectly. I would never do that. However, when it comes to policing and use of force and officer involved shootings, because people have watched television shows and movies about and cops, because they've watched these shows since they were children for 20, 30, 40 years, they think that they know more about policing than they actually do. So everybody is interested and everybody can be an expert. And that's fine. I like having the conversation, but I
Yeah.
think that's the biggest challenge is that with no education, no experience, everyone thinks that they're an expert.
Yeah. And, the other part that I suppose I could say it bothers me because we are so, we preach transparency. Wouldn't you agree? We have to
Absolutely.
be transparent. Uh,
Absolutely.
to be quite honest with you, I think that what you're doing and what all of us that have these channels and these pages, that's 100% full transparency. What I don't like is when I'll give you an example. You get into an OIS, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in the state of New Mexico, you have to let the public know about a critical incident. Somehow, some way, you got to release information to the community. Someone from a PIO or media. Hey, this is the captain. Let me tell you what happened on this day. This was a radio call. Officers responded, and they show you. They do a great job. Don't get me wrong. They show you the weapon, and they warn you, hey, it's going to be, you know, uh, uh, a little violent, and they'll blur out stuff. Great, I got it. But here's what I don't like. What bothers me. What about the outcome? What happened afterwards? Because everybody gets this fix, this rush, right? And it's so sensationalized, especially if it's, you can agree to this, male white officer and the suspect happens to be black. Oh my gosh. Now it's even worse, right? And we have an outcry, there's outrage and all that good stuff, but we don't let the public know what was the outcome. Meaning, was the shooting in policy? Did the officer get any type of training? Or, yeah, this was a bad shooting. The officer got suspended for this. We don't. We just do the beginning of it, but we never really bother with the outcome. What's your thoughts?
I think that that's a great point. And to that point, police departments have been doing a good job of being transparent on the front end. So there's a case, I can't remember what city it was in, but
Mm-hmm.
it happened in early November. There was an officer involved shooting, and I can't remember the city off the top of my head, but there's an
Okay.
officer involved shooting where a police officer during a domestic dispute just shot and killed a young mother and an infant.
Okay.
And that happened, I think, on November 2nd. There was essentially 20 days
Mm-hmm.
between when the incident happened and when the body camera footage was put out. Now, the family, and I don't like to talk bad about family who are
Mm-hmm.
adjacent to people who are involved in officer involved shootings, I can't imagine what they're going through. But
Correct.
in that 20 days, in this particular case, the the husband who was or the boyfriend who was there the entire time and saw it all happen, he told several lies to the media during that 20-day period. So
Mm.
it's police departments have to be transparent.
Yeah.
Transparency is important. It's not just important for the community, because I honestly believe that when an officer is involved in a shooting or critical incident, the community absolutely deserves to know what happened, but also for the officer. So, as we all know, police officers, when they're involved in a critical incident or an officer involved shooting, and something, either Ben Crump or a civil rights attorney or some family who wasn't even there says something negative about them in the media, the
Yeah.
police officer can't call up Channel 7. They can't call up CNN and publicly defend
Yeah.
themselves. They just have to take it.
Yeah.
And especially when there's something that is an obvious untruth, something that's not true, that can be verified objectively on body camera video, I honestly think that the police department owes it to those officers to at least get some of it out there, at least to refute those narrative that just aren't true. And of course, we have to make sure that all the witnesses are interviewed,
Mhm.
and but really getting that body camera footage out there, I think that police departments absolutely have to do, not only for the public but also for the officers. But to what you said, I agree, because there is no, hey, 7 months ago there was an officer involved
Yeah.
shooting, and these are some of the public perceptions. Let me show you what the investigation found. So you're right. There's that initial critical incident briefing, but there's no post. There's no post.
Yeah.
Now, at least on my side, from the Albuquerque Police Department, we did something called a Force Review Board. And I
Yeah.
was actually the investigator on that, where I would investigate the cases and I would do all the presentations for the Force Review Board to the city leaders and the admin, and I loved
Mhm.
that job. It was great. But yeah, I think something like that, not to that extent, but to the public, would be a great idea to say, hey, this is what was found. There was some
Yeah.
training, there was discipline, or hey, this thing was completely in policy. Here's the policies.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. That's a great idea that I think the public deserves to know, and especially for officer involved shootings that are reasonable, officers want that as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's one of those things where I always wonder that because I sat on those we call them use of force review boards, where, yeah, they do the presentation and they determine three things: drawing and exhibiting, tactics, and the use of deadly force, right? In policy, out of policy. And then if it's out of policy, okay. Oh, okay. So now what do we do? Do we send them a training, maybe frame allegations and sustain and get suspension? Who know? Or if it's so friggin' bad that, okay, guess what? The criminal filings, it got rejected. Now we got to go to the admin. So now what happens? And everybody's left, So look, I'm not blaming just a department to be accountable, but you know what? I also blame the community too, dude. You want to cry and be have an outrage for this horrible, horrible shooting, right? But 7, 8 months later, you're not calling asking to see what the outcome is. And I don't see a problem with that. And I think that's super, super important. It's one of those things where hopefully, and some have done, don't get me wrong, we've gotten better. You and I can agree to the Memphis PD. It's a great example, right? Those 5 officers in that Falcon unit, whatever that specialized unit, and they just, I mean, that was horrible. I mean, to me, it's insulting for me to even give you an opinion about what these officers did. And the chief got rid of them right away, and they filed criminal charges, which is great. That's transparency. But you and I have seen cases where, yes, it's an OIS. All these months go by. There is no criminal charges. It got rejected, but now we're in the admin portion of this incident, and what was the outcome? And you're left with a big question mark. That's all.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, again, even if you think about cases that are very famous cases, there are people who still think that Breonna Taylor was sleeping in her bed during the officer involved shooting. There are
Yeah.
people who honestly believe
Yeah.
that, even though it's probably one of the two most publicized officer involved shootings over the last decade.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's not fair for anyone who's injured in a care or killed in a case like that. It's also
Yeah.
not fair to the involved officers.
Oh, no, 100%. And John Mattingly, shout out to you for coming on. We had a great conversation. I was fortunate to talk about the IA portion. You got to watch the episode and then check it out what we talked about. Hey, man, let's move on to something that I always ask every single guest: worst incident in your career.
The The worst incident in my career happened when I was a rookie. I was a 23-year-old rookie working a graveyard in an area of the city that was called the War Zone. It was unofficially called the War Zone up until just a couple of years ago. Most violent area of the city. I was on graveyard, right out of the police academy. And we took a call, and essentially the call wasn't a big deal. It was a 15 or 16-year-old kid called in that he was home alone, and he was lived in an apartment, and there was people who were knocking on his door at an apartment complex, and he wanted the police to come to check things out, make sure he's okay. That was the
Okay.
call. I mean, this area, every single day we got shootings and stabbings and armed robbery. So this call just wasn't a big deal. So me and my buddy went to the call, and even as a 23-year-old rookie, I had the presence of mind that as we went on scene to let the dispatcher know, hey, can you let the caller know that we're on site, we're going to be knocking on his door, just so he would know to answer the door, because this was the nature of the call,
Yeah.
is
People were
irritating
knocking.
people or threatening people knocking on his door. And so we did. We went over to the apartment. And as I get there, I knock on the door. I'm on one side of the door. My buddy's on the other side of the door, and he opens the door and he's standing there. And I mean, this is just what Roger Fortson did from the case in Florida. He was standing there and he was holding a gun. He was holding a gun down at his sides, and it's just something that you don't expect that to happen.
Mm.
And because I was fresh out of the academy, everything I had heard and been drilled into me in the academy
Yeah.
just started flooding through me. I'm thinking, okay, from that position, he can raise the gun and shoot me faster than I can respond. I'm thinking I'm going to get shot, and I'm all the while I'm drawing out my gun, and my gun is pointed right at his chest, and I'm screaming, "Drop the gun, drop the gun!" And listen, he's not doing it. And he's not doing it, and I'm screaming over and over again for him to drop the gun, and he's just has this blank look on his face, and he's just staring through me, and he's not dropping the gun. And I couldn't understand why. And I started to pull the trigger, and slack started to come off, and then all of a sudden he dropped the gun. And the relief I felt was unbelievable. And it's it's one of those things that was the closest. And I worked another 15 years on the street after that, but that was the
Yeah.
closest I came to an officer involved shooting. And you know one of the things about that is we didn't have body cameras at this time. We had
Mhm.
these belt tape recorders that only recorded audio. And if you would have asked me, I would have passed the polygraph test. How long were you pointing the gun at him, yelling at him to drop the gun? How long? I would have told you it was 8 or 9 seconds.
Yeah.
Listening back to the belt tape, it was less than 3 seconds. If you would have asked me, what was your partner saying during all this? I didn't hear anything. I would have said, my partner didn't say a word. I was the only one yelling. But on the belt tape, we're both screaming at this guy.
Mm.
And, I spent years wondering, why did that happen, and not having any idea why that happened to me. It wasn't until I took a force science class years later that I learned that these are the kinds of things that happen when your body is under incredible stress. And in talking to the kid after the incident, what was he thinking? What was going through his head? What would possess him to do that? He said, well, it's a pellet gun. It's not real. That was his thinking. And it sure looked real.
Yeah.
But that was the closest I ever got to an officer
Wow.
involved shooting. Up until the Roger Fortson case, the case in Florida, I always thought all these years, I went to the Master's in Criminal Justice and law school, and my time as a force investigator, I always thought that, had I actually used deadly force, that it would have been a legal shooting. I
Yeah.
would have been good, because
Correct.
there's no reason for him to be standing there holding a gun. He can definitely pull, even if I'm drawn out at him, he can shoot me before I can fire back.
Correct.
And the idea that had I used deadly force, instead of sitting here talking to you, would I be talking to a parole board trying to get out early?
Yeah, no, 100%, man. I appreciate you sharing that. Just to show you that, here you are, 20, almost 20 years later, and it's in your mind, and it frame by frame, exactly of the incident. And I don't think many people realize the mental wellness aspect to law enforcement, which I'm so happy that it's at the forefront now compared to 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And I'm really starting to see and hear, and I was going to ask you, and I'm sure you can agree with me, that perhaps discipline should also be part of mental wellness, because we go through, it's an emotional roller coaster, right? You're ostracized, and you should get help, and we should be there to help you when you are facing some serious allegations of internal affairs.
Absolutely. And the mental wellness aspect of a lot of police departments having different programs for mental wellness for police officers, that is something, a great trend I think we've all seen over the
Yeah.
last couple of years that we didn't have 20 years ago, or for like you, 24 years ago or so.
Yeah. Yeah.
We didn't have that. We have that now. One of the coolest things I think that I did is in the last year of my career, they asked me to be one of the instructors for a class called ABLE, Active Bystandership in Law Enforcement. A lot of police departments from Georgetown University. It's basically an 8-hour course of police ethics. A lot of police departments, hundreds of thousands of cops are going through it.
Oh,
And I was
nice.
one of the few instructors for our department to get all 1,000 people through it. And in that, there's an entire section on exactly what I talked about, that, hey, when your body's under stress, here are some of the things that are going to happen.
Mm.
And it talks about, and I think like, had I had that, and I would have had that knowledge, that information, like I wouldn't have spent 10 years wondering the hell happened to me. Why didn't I hear my buddy yelling? Why did
Yeah.
I honestly think it was 8 seconds and it was under three?
Yeah.
And we're actually giving that class to police officers or new officers who are in the police academy now, and that's the kind of shift that I see in police departments that I think is a great thing going forward.
That's awesome, Daniel. I really appreciate that, man. Let's talk about cool stuff. Police law news. How's that going? And apparently, our law degrees didn't quite get us to be licensed attorneys, which we were talking before we came on and started recording that. Man, I don't even know if I want to get my license and just have my phone blow up and 2 o'clock in the morning. Don't let all this fool you. This youngness. I'm getting ready to turn 56, and I don't know if I want to wake up at 2 in the morning to respond to an OIS in the middle of a Sunday morning, Saturday night. Right? I mean, I think this is great. What do you think?
I like that you said that because I did pass the bar. I'm actually in the process of submitting the paperwork to get licensed. So
Oh,
I'm
good
sure.
for you. Congratulations, man.
Thank you, thank you. So I'm sure I will get licensed, but I know that once I get my law license, that's exactly what I'm going to want to do. I'm going to want to represent police officers and police unions,
Yes.
and I'm going to want to be the one of the individuals who goes out at 2 o'clock in the morning to an officer-involved shooting. And I also struggle with that because I think, I'm 41, and I think, do I really want to be on call all the time? Like I did that for a lot of years. I was on the fatal team. Do I really want to be on call? Do I want to do that? And I think like, well, do I just want to do family law to pay off my student loan? And then I think, no,
There,
no, I know what I'm going to do, even if I shouldn't, once I get a law license. So to be honest, I've been procrastinating filling out the paperwork because I know once I have it, I'm going to use it. And that's probably not the
yeah. Well,
probably not what I should jump into right away, but
yeah.
I know that I would want to.
It's what we work hard for. With all due respect, yes, one day I too will get my license because we've worked very hard for it. It's a journey that not many people understand what it's like, especially working full time as a police officer, right? And going to law school, all the sacrifices with family, et cetera, et cetera. I do too. I would help out anyone, but uh, would you agree with me when I say that there will never be enough platforms in social media for law enforcement? There will never be enough.
I agree with you 100%. There will absolutely never be enough platforms. And anytime I meet someone who has a podcast, who does a show, who even just does posts or commentary about this stuff, I always try to follow them if I think that they know what they're talking about and then they're doing something good.
Yeah,
Because I agree 100%. There's never going to be enough,
yeah,
especially when it comes to how the algorithms work. And you have anti-police activists out there who have
yeah,
no police training whatsoever, who have millions of followers.
yeah,
And guys like us, I know I don't have a million followers,
yeah,
but I really would love someone like Two Cops One
yeah. Eric.
Donut, or other platforms like that. I mean, if they get to a million, great. That's exactly what I want to happen because yeah, I agree. There's never going to be enough people talking about this stuff.
No, 100%, man. How can we get a hold of you, man?
Yeah, so the best way to get a hold of me is basically I'm over at Police Law News, essentially everywhere. I do short videos on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram. I also I'm on X at Police Law News, and one of my favorite things I do is I write a newsletter. It's called a Police Law Newsletter over on Substack, where usually once a week I'll break down more in long form. I'll break down the use of force. So Substack, a police law newsletter over there, writing about the cases I sometimes like more than just talking about them. But if you look at police law news on any platform, that's where I am.
Awesome. Hey, man, I'm going to leave the floor up to you before we wrap it up. Any advice that you have for anyone who wants to come on to be a police officer?
Yeah, so the advice that I have is let it go. Let it go. A lot of times, even now in today's, even after everything we know now about body cams and First Amendment auditors, a lot of times we see police officers on calls where, someone's being a jerk, but they haven't committed a crime. And as the person's walking away, they're saying something stupid, and the police officer just keeps engaging. Keeps engaging. And I just want to remind anyone out there that, listen, the goal, if they want to walk away and leave, that's the goal. That's when you win. The objective is to get them to leave. The objective is to not argue and win an argument with the biggest asshole in your town. Let them leave.
Yeah, that's what they call that. They got a fancy word for that called emotional intelligence. Isn't that right?
Absolutely.
Hey, man, I had a great time. Look, I would love to invite you to do a breakdown for me in the future, man.
Absolutely. That's what I love to do. So
Yeah,
anytime,
let's do
I'd
it,
love
man.
to.
We'll grab an incident and I'll ask a whole bunch of questions and have some fun. And more important than anything, it's to educate. I love your short videos. You get right to the point. But I'm being selfish here, and I would love to have you come on and just have a 10, 15-minute conversation about a critical incident that's going viral, so that we can educate the public. Brother, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And it's time to say goodbye. And please, if you like this episode, there is plenty more. Just click up there. And like always, please be safe out there. And don't forget to go Code 6. Thank you.